Welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm Nikki Snoblin, the Vice President for Program Advocacy and Action for the League of Women Voters of the Lake Forest, Lake Bluff area. Typically, our President, Lori Rose, would be making this introduction, but unfortunately, she's not able to be with us today. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization. We engage in political advocacy and education, but we never support or oppose candidates or a political party. Our membership is open to anyone 16 years of age or older who subscribe to our purposes and policies. Our members are men and women from all over the northern part of Lake County. If you're interested, please stop at our membership table in the back there before you leave. We would welcome you to ask any questions you might have about membership. And also be aware that partisan political activity on your part is not a barrier to membership. People ask that sometimes. Many of our members, because they're interested in civic and political issues, are politically active. We encourage that among our members. The only thing we ask of our members is that they not use the League's name when they're engaged in some sort of partisan activity. So don't let that stop you. We are proud to have the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy as our co-sponsor today. The center is a 501c3 whose agenda for political reform includes numerous structural changes for the nation's political life, including some of the issues that are going to be discussed today by our panel. The center's website can be found at stevensoncenterondemocracy.org. And while I'm at it, I should mention that the League's website can be found at lwvlflb.org, or just Google League of Women Voters Lake Forest. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Nancy Stevenson, President of the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy. Nancy was the CEO of Voices for Illinois Children from 1984 to 1992 and is now a trustee emerita of the University of Chicago, past chair of what is now Illinois Humanities, and a member of the Chicago Women Take Action. She's interested in numerous civic organizations as well. Nancy and her husband, Adlai Stevenson III, have 4 children and 9 grandchildren. Nancy, will you step up and say a word?
Thank you. Thank you, Nikki. And this is one of those wonderful moments when the Stevenson Center was invited to collaborate, but the League of Women Voters did all the work. So I'm just happy to be riding along as a guest for this wonderful program. And by the way, Susan Garrett is one of the honorary members of our board. Thank you, Susan, for lots of creative ideas. And there are many Stevenson Center people who come to the Stevenson Center programs who are here today. I'm so pleased that we may not have done the work, but some of our people were coming because they recognize a good program when they see one. The League of Women Voters has been doing for over 50 years, working for structural and civic improvements, as in this program, Safeguarding Democracy. I think that's a wonderful title for all the work that the League of Women Voters does. And they've been doing it for 50 years. So the Stevenson Center is we're just newcomers, babies in this work. But we have something called the Agenda for Political Reform, in which we support such things as reform of campaign financing, reform of redistricting voting areas, voting access, and we have collaborated with the League on a wonderful program for abolishing the Electoral College. So the Agenda for Political Reform has 12 or 14 items. There are a lot of them. If you're interested, you can see our website, as Nikki very nicely announced, because that has more details about the agenda. But it's the same, really, as the League's agenda. So we're following in your footsteps with pride and eagerness. There are so many people. One of the things that the Stevenson Center relies upon are our volunteers, which is very much like the League of Women Voters. So today, it's not only thanking Lori Rose, who is your current president, Wynn Kane, who's your past president, who comes to a lot of Stevenson Center programs, thank goodness, with David. And a wonderful team. I have to get out my mag to read. The team that put together this program: Ann Sorensen, Carol Kay, Joanne Desmond, Katie Anderson, Mary Matthews, who was the one who calls me all the time on the phone about collaborations, for which we are grateful, and of course Wynn Kane. So volunteers are the source of everything in our lives, and I know that they're the source of everything in the League's life as well. Thank you for this program. I look forward to seeing old friends like David Melton and hearing him, but making new ones like Jim Allen and Madeline Dubeck. Thank you so much for letting us ride on your coattails.
Thanks so much for that, Nancy. Your organization does terrific work. I love getting your emails and hearing about what you have going on. We have a few ground rules or guidelines for today's event. The moderator, Susan Garrett, will ask the questions, and any panelist may answer them. This is going to be an informal discussion, so we aren't imposing any kind of specific time limits, but the moderator can cut the discussion short if she feels that we need to move on to the next question. So next we need you to submit questions for the panelists. Think of yourselves as the grease that will keep the motor running here, or the machine moving. We have some questions to start out with, but we need your questions to continue. So we have card runners, as we call them, with index cards and pencils. If you have a question you would like to have asked, just raise your hand and they will be happy to bring you a card and a pencil. Once you've completed your question, raise your hand again and they'll come and pick it up from you. We have our question sorters over here who will combine similar questions or reword if something is needed for clarity, and then they'll be brought up here to be asked. Do plan to stay around. At the end, we're going to have refreshments, which you see over here, and you'll have an opportunity to speak with the panelists, and if you have any further questions or anything else you'd like information on from them, we can just have informal discussions. And then one other thing, if you haven't already, please do silence your mobile devices. So now I'd like to tell you about today's panelists. They all have name cards there, so you know who's who. Jim Allen, all the way on your left, other than Susan. Jim grew up reading and delivering the Chicago Tribune and Sun-Times on a paper route in Mundelein, and then became a news reporter, ultimately working out of City Hall as the Daily Herald's Chicago bureau chief, which kind of sounds like a paperboy's dream to me. Jim later became the director of communications for the Chicago Election Board. He's now in his 13th year managing media relations, mass mailings, correspondence, legal notices, website content, and strategic planning for one of the nation's largest election jurisdictions with more than 1.5 million voters. Madeline Dubeck in the middle here. Madeline is executive director of Change Illinois and is a passionate longtime advocate for improving government and politics in Illinois. As the former vice president of policy at the Better Government Association, Madeline was responsible for a new law that limits golden parachutes for public executives. She also worked to stop efforts to limit government transparency and champion laws that boost government efficiency. Madeline writes a government-focused column for the Chicago Sun-Times. Prior to her direct advocacy and policy work, she spent 32 years in journalism, much of that time at the Daily Herald covering local and state government and politics. And David Melton is an attorney who specialized in business and intellectual property litigation during his 30 years in the private practice of law in Chicago, but who also handled a number of election and voting rights cases pro bono. Since his retirement from the active practice of law approximately 10 years ago, David has focused his effort on various issues, including campaign finance reform in his capacity as a senior advisor to the organization now known as Reform for Illinois, and on police oversight in his capacity as co-chair of the Chicago Council of Lawyers Civil Rights Committee. And then I'd like to introduce Susan Garrett next, who will be stepping up here as the moderator of this event. To many of us, Susan needs no introduction, but I want to tell you a little bit about what she's doing now. She's currently the chair of the Center for Illinois Politics, which is a new nonpartisan organization that provides fact-based information to empower people and encourage them to be active in politics. It's developing into sort of a clearinghouse of information that voters can go to learn about candidates and elections. Susan was formerly the chair of the Illinois Campaign for Political Reform, which is now Reform for Illinois. Susan was a member of the Illinois General Assembly for 14 years, first as a representative and then as a senator. As a legislator, one of her chief areas of focus was government reform, which makes her a perfect fit for this event. So Susan, if you will kindly come up, we can go ahead and get started. These are the starter questions.
Oh. Are we going to have the panelists talk a little bit about what they do? Okay. Hi. It's great to be here. I feel like this is my home away from home. I was a former president of the League of Women Voters, and there isn't a day that goes by that memories don't come up, and all these different types of panel discussions and plotting and scheming. How are we going to get people to vote? It just is part of my everyday life, and everybody here understands that, or you wouldn't be here. I think we have some of the experts. These are the experts on the topic that they're going to be talking about. And so I'd like to start by having each of them talk a little bit about, for instance, David Melton can talk about campaign finance reform, and Madeline will talk about redistricting, and Jim will talk about making sure that we have equal and accessible access to the polls. So David, if you could start out, that'd be great.
Sure.
A couple minutes.
Sure. Campaign finance reform, that's a topic that when you bring it up generally makes people's eyes glaze over, but it is a topic on which, according to recent polls, about 90% of people agree we have a serious problem. Unfortunately, about 90% of people also believe there's no solution. They're right about the first part, but wrong about the second part. The reason we need campaign finance reform is because during our country's 250-year plus history, we have never actually designed a system that is designed to encourage candidates to raise money to run their campaigns in ways that are actually fully consistent with our notion of a democracy and principle of one person, one vote. This was an oversight on our country's founders' part. We've tried to reform the system a couple times in our history, which I'd be happy to go into in greater detail if anyone's interested, but we didn't actually try and design a system on those occasions. What we said was, well, we don't like, you politicians, it's your job to worry about where you get your money. We don't care how you do it. A couple times in our history we said, well, after 100 years of having a system whereby government elected officials would hand out government jobs or government contracts and take rebates and fund their campaigns that way, we said after 100 years, well, we don't like you doing that, so raising the money for your campaigns is your problem, but don't do it by giving rebates or kickbacks or getting kickbacks. And then we went another 50 years where politicians were turning to wealthy corporations and individuals, and then we said we didn't like that as part of the progressive era, and we said you have to tell us where you get your money, and you can't get it from corporations who we're going to bar corporations from contributing, and we're going to impose limits on how much rich people can give you and contribute to your campaign. Unfortunately, though, while we told politicians what they couldn't do, we didn't tell them how to go about actually set up a system whereby they could actually opt in to raise money in a way that we thought was acceptable. And so on that second set of reforms, the politicians sabotaged the system basically, because if they had followed it, it wouldn't have allowed them to raise enough money to run their campaigns adequately. And over the course of the 20th century, we've had a couple sets of scandals which caused us to reform these laws further. After the Teapot Dome scandal in the 20s, and then again more emphatically after the Watergate scandal in the 70s. And after the Watergate scandal, we made some significant reforms to that system. But again, we didn't set up a system and say, this is the way it should work. We just said, you can't do this and you can't do this. We need to now set up a system whereby we say to politicians, here's a system by which you can remain an ethical, honest, unbought politician and still be able to raise the money you need to run your campaign and run for office. That's on all of us. That's our responsibility as believing in a democracy to do that. And we actually, over the past 50 years, have come up with 3 different varieties of systems that are possibilities that we could use to do that. So one of them is what's called a block grant system or clean money system, whereby once a candidate demonstrates sufficiently that they're a serious candidate, you give them a set of money and you say, use this money to run your campaign, but you're not allowed to get any other contributions because we don't want you to be corrupted. Most famously, we adopted the system in the Watergate reforms, and it worked very well for 25 years. For 25 years, what that system said is, once you get your party's nomination, we'll fund your campaign between the end of the convention and the general election. And for 25 years, all the candidates for US president ran under that system and did not accept additional contributions in that period. That included people like Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. The only reason that system fell apart was because Congress, in its wisdom, failed to adjust it for the ever-increasing cost of presidential campaigns, and eventually the system did not supply enough money to run an adequate campaign. So let's call that that's a vanilla variety of campaign finance reform, a block grant system. The second system is what we call a small donor matching system. This type of system was first adopted in New York City after a political scandal there, a corruption scandal. And the way it works, it says, once you've demonstrated you're a sufficiently serious candidate, we will give you public matching funds to match small donations you receive. Now, so each donation you get of up to $150 or $200, we will match it, and we'll not only match it on a dollar-for-dollar basis, but we'll match it with enough dollars so that this will be an adequate way for you to rely solely on small donations combined with the matching public funds to actually run an adequate campaign. Under the New York system, they now match at, I think, 7 to 1. For a long time, they were matching at 6 to 1. So each time a candidate raised $1 in a small donation, they would get $6 in matching funds, so it would be worth $7 to them. So a $100 donation was worth $700 to the campaign. That allowed candidates to raise enough money to run adequate campaigns. And over the years, 70 to 80% of candidates in the New York municipal elections have opted into this system, and it's worked very well. And there's a lot of history on it, and it's got a track record. And it's actually formed the basis for the adoption of similar variations of that system in about 14 or 15 other large and small municipalities and counties around the country since then. So that's the chocolate option. We've got the vanilla and the chocolate. Now let's talk about the third one, the strawberry. And that one's a more recent one. That's called the voucher system. The city of Seattle recently adopted this system for their municipal elections. And under this system, you basically send out a voucher for $100 to every registered voter in your jurisdiction. And they can contribute them, they can give them to whoever campaign they want to help finance. And then the candidates turn that money back into the public entity that provides the funds that certificate represents. We've only had one election in Seattle where the system has been tried out, and it's worked okay. It's still got some tweaking that it probably needs, but all 3 of these systems share this common benefit. As you may know, starting about 15 years ago, the Supreme Court decided it did not like any limits on the ability of rich people to exert undue influence on our political system. And so we've had decisions like Citizens United, which I'm sure you've all heard of. Those decisions have imposed limits on state legislatures and Congress that make it more difficult for those bodies to try and regulate campaign finance. The beauty of these 3 systems that I described, the vanilla, chocolate, and strawberry versions, is that they're all opt-in systems, which means the candidates have to volunteer to opt into the system. You're not imposing them on any candidate. Candidate can opt out and choose not to participate. In each case, in exchange for their opting in and getting the public funds, you can impose limits on them that we could not otherwise impose unilaterally through a legislative process, and especially in light of the recent Supreme Court decisions. So you can get them to agree to accept limits on the kinds of contributions they'll accept, not to accept any contributions from anybody, say, doing business with the city or the county or the state. You can get them to agree to limits on the sizes of the contributions that they'll accept. And you can even get them to agree to limits on how much they'll spend in an overall system. So because these are opt-in systems, they all mostly avoid most of the problems created by decisions like Citizens United. So that it's not true that we need a constitutional amendment before we can fix this problem. We have the ability to fix this problem now if we adopt some combination of these, one or more of these three systems for financing campaigns, which are more fully consistent with our ideas about how politicians can and should raise money to fund their election campaigns. And the idea, as you can tell, behind all three of them is this is a shared responsibility. Running for office is part of our democratic system. And we have to recognize that just as we pay for legislators' salaries once they get in office, we bear some of the responsibility for financing the cost of campaigns as well, especially in an ever-growing and ever more complex society like ours, where the cost of campaigns is continually escalating because of that complexity. So that's where we are. In terms of where we are in Illinois, it's very simple. Illinois did not adopt the second round of campaign finance reforms that were adopted in the early 19th century at the federal level for 100 years, until the Blagojevich scandal. At that point, Illinois first adopted its first set of campaign finance limits for state office holders in 2009, which went into effect in 2011. Now, by that point, that system already had a lot of holes in it because it had been prevailing in a number of other states, and at the federal level, and politicians and lawyers had been poking holes in it for about 35 years. And those problems were compounded by the Citizens United set of decisions starting to come down about that time as well. So the Illinois limit system has not worked terribly well since we first adopted it in 2009, but it has helped somewhat, and it's not a substitute, though, for us designing a more appropriate system to encourage politicians to follow, adopt into, to raise money in a more ethical and a way that's consistent with our democratic principles. And we did have a couple bills introduced in Illinois recently, but they haven't gone anywhere. There was one introduced in the Senate by Daniel Biss a couple years ago that passed the Illinois Senate, went nowhere in the Illinois House, and is not likely to go anywhere in the Illinois House unless we can convince Michael Madigan to change his view of the world, because he gets his power from controlling the flow of campaign financing dollars. So that's where we are in Illinois. We also have proposals in addition to the state ones. We have done proposals, model legislation and ordinances and so on that counties or municipalities could adopt, and we have undertaken some campaigns to try and get the city of Chicago or Cook County or other cities in Illinois to consider adopting them. So far we haven't been successful, but we're working on that. So that's where we are.
So let me just follow up with a couple of questions. The City of Chicago did pass a non-binding referendum. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The city of Chicago did have a non-binding referendum. The details are a little grisly, like sausage making, in that the reason it was put on the ballot was it was put on by Mayor Emanuel to block out a referendum on an elected school board. But nevertheless, it made it on to the ballot, and as was the case in most of the similar elections around the country over the past 20 years, it got about 80% of the vote approving, saying, yes, let's adopt a small donor matching system as a way of financing campaigns. There were subsequently lots of negotiations that went on in the city council, but it never resulted in any action. And although Mayor Emanuel had expressed support for it in order to get it on the ballot initially, he never pushed it, and it hasn't gone anywhere in the city council. There are discussions going on among a variety of organizations in the city to try and revive that and pursue it again, but that's basically where it stands.
And then one more follow-up. So we just experienced the most expensive gubernatorial race of all time right here in Illinois. We bypassed the California spending on their gubernatorial race when Meg Whitman put, I think, $230 or $40 million of her own in, but we topped that just recently. And so when you talk about campaign finance reform, you always have the super wealthy who are able to come in and, as we say in our world, blow the caps. Do you want to talk about blowing the caps?
Sure.
And what that means and what allows candidates to come in and all of a sudden receive as much money as they possibly can? There's no limit whatsoever, whereas we do have a structure that does require limits, but we have a loophole. So that's the loophole that I want you to
And
talk about.
that loophole was actually imposed by the Supreme Court in the decision of Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976. That ruled on the constitutionality of many of those Watergate reforms that were adopted in the 70s. And basically what the Supreme Court suggested in that case, among other things, was that you couldn't put any limits on the amount of money that individuals could spend of their own money on their own campaigns. And that's been the accepted common wisdom that that's the law at the moment.
But isn't there a loophole where if somebody who's running for mayor of the city of Chicago, Willie Wilson, and he writes himself a check?
Yes.
Okay,
So
let's,
the way this works is, the Supreme Court, after the Citizens United decision, there were a couple additional decisions. So Congress had passed, not Congress, several of the states which had adopted different campaign finance schemes, had passed schemes whereby if a large self-funder like a Rauner or a Pritzker came into a race and started spending their own money in disproportionate amounts, the state finance system would then give the other candidates additional money out of the state financing system to balance that out. Supreme Court said that that's not permissible because that infringes too much on rich people's rights, rich people's free speech rights, and spending their money in their own campaign. So as a result, any kind of limits that are imposed have very limited leeway in what you can do in terms of compensating when a large self-funder comes into it, whether that's a billionaire coming into it or whether it's one of these outside dark money groups after Citizens United that comes in and starts spending money. So the only option open under the Supreme Court case, the key case here is a case called the Davis case, is that you can lift the caps on everybody, but that's all the Supreme Court has said you can do. You can't compensate by giving the other candidates more money. They said that's unconstitutional. So after this decision, after these decisions came down, the Illinois legislature in 2011 amended the caps they had initially adopted in 2009, and they put in this lifting the caps provision, but it just says, if you are a candidate for a state legislative race and your opponent spends more than $100,000, or a self-funder like a billionaire puts more than $100,000 into his own campaign, or lends it more than $100,000, or a dark money group comes in and spends more than $100,000 against you in the campaign, then the caps are off for everybody. Nobody is subject to any campaign finance limits caps. You can collect as much money from individual donors as you want at that point. And that's for state legislators. For state constitutional officers, 6 state constitutional officers in statewide races, the cap is $250,000. So if a gubernatorial candidate comes in and drops more than $250,000 into his own campaign or his or her own campaign, the caps are off for everybody. And that's why we have that and why it's such a crude tool. It results in a lot of problems, but it's the only option open for us currently under the current Supreme Court precedent.
so I do want to say that I think we are the only state that has that loophole.
No, some other states have that, a lot of other states have a similar kind of loophole because it flows from that Supreme Court decision, basically.
Yeah, okay. The problem is, though, that Illinois, whether it's the mayoral race in Chicago, legislative races throughout the state, and certainly the gubernatorial race, to see the kind of money that was spent, I mean, I know everybody in this room would agree, we have to find a way to protect, the rest of us and make sure that people who are interested in running for office, who aren't millionaires or billionaires, have that opportunity. So thank you for that, David. We'll come back to you with more
Sure.
questions. Madeline, let's talk about redistricting. I have my own story on that, but I'll wait afterwards when we're talking one-on-one.
Okay.
I got redistricted out.
All right. Good story. Change Illinois is about a 10-year-old organization that first actually worked on the campaign contribution limits law David just spoke about. And it has been involved in various iterations over the years attempting to achieve redistricting reform in Illinois. We currently have a couple of constitutional amendments in the legislative hopper in Springfield, HJRCA 15 and SJRCA 4. The Senate version of what we're calling the Fair Maps Amendment is sponsored by State Senator Julie Morrison, who represents where we're sitting today. But your 2 state representatives in that Senate district have not signed on as sponsors yet, so you might all want to reach out to them. We have 34 senators who signed on to support the Senate version of this amendment, just a couple of votes short of the supermajority needed to actually approve it, were it to be called for a vote by the Senate President, John Cullerton. We've kind of focused on the Senate. We have a lot of work still to do in the House, where we have 24 representatives signed on supporting it so far. As you're probably all aware, there have been several previous attempts to achieve redistricting reform through citizen petition. The Illinois Supreme Court has rejected every one of those, and our state constitution allows for only a very narrow approach to making changes to the General Assembly and the legislature. So having been through that disappointing experience a few times, we've now shifted gears and are trying a legislative approach. If we could get these pieces of legislation called and approved in the Senate and the Illinois House, it would go directly onto the ballot, and there would be no need, hopefully, for a legal challenge. So the Fair Maps Amendment is modeled after a bill that actually received 105 yes House votes a few years ago in 2016, that was offered up by former State Representative Jack Franks from McHenry. He's now the McHenry County Board Chairman, no longer in the State House. It has some very powerful provisions to guarantee the rights of minorities, not just the concept of a majority-minority district, but what's known as a minority influence district, so that if there is a collection of certain numbers of minority groups, they could be drawn into districts in order to have enough power to influence the outcome of the election in those districts. The amendment would set up a 16-member independent redistricting commission. The members of that commission would be chosen by the Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court and the senior-most justice of the opposing party. There would be a certain number of Democrats who could be chosen, a certain number of Republicans, 7 apiece, and then a couple of independents with the option for an independent tiebreaker. Every single one of their communications and their work would be done openly and transparently and subject to the Open Meetings Act and the Freedom of Information Act. There's a requirement that they would need to have 30 hearings before any map could be adopted, 20 before a map is proposed and 10 after a map is proposed. Those are kind of the broad strokes outlines of the amendment. Change Illinois is also working on some other voting rights legislation, along with lots of other pro-democracy groups. We've tried to raise awareness and educate and helped pass automatic voter registration in Illinois. We'll be continuing to raise awareness and push for a full census count, which is closely tied to redistricting, of course, and making sure that everyone is counted and everyone has a voice and a vote. It's our belief that gerrymandering in Illinois, whether it's controlled by Democrats or Republicans, is where corruption is born. When politicians start drawing lines, they're deciding who wins and they're taking their vote away from you. And so we work to try to stop that from happening. We're also working to try to open up access to the ballot in Illinois. We have a couple of bills, Senate Bill 2083 and House Bill 3114, which we worked on. I started working on it when I was still at the Better Government Association, worked on it with some of our friends from Reform for Illinois and others. It would do 3 things. One, would create a pilot program run by the State Board of Elections that would allow for signatures for candidates to be collected electronically, so that, as is done in Denver, Colorado, you could check before someone signs your candidate petition to see if they're really registered at the address they're about to use. This is 2019, and we're still collecting signatures on paper. And every election, Jim Allen has to sit through hours and hours and hours and days and months of candidate petition challenges and games that are played by the powers that be in Illinois politics to control who has access to the ballot. E-sign application in Denver has dramatically cut down on the numbers of challenges to candidates' petitions. Again, it's 2019. When you file to run as a candidate in Illinois, all you're required to provide is your physical address. We think it's time that we also require candidates to provide a phone number and an email address so that our friends in the media can easily reach the 2,500 candidates running for library board and water reclamation district and mosquito abatement district, so that information can be shared with all of you about what these candidates intend to do to you and for you. A third component of that bill would bring some uniformity and sanity to the numbers of signatures required to run for some offices in Illinois. We currently have a situation where it takes 20,000 plus voter signatures to run for Cook County-wide office. It takes 12,500 signatures to run for mayor of Chicago. And when you have 14 candidates running, they have to be 12,500 different people on every candidate's petitions.
And let me just interject here. What happens if a candidate's petitions are challenged and I signed one petition and then mistakenly didn't realize it signed somebody else's petition? Then what happens?
Well, if someone challenges that, you could be tossed off and prevented from running, as I'm sure Jim can talk about at length when we get to him.
We'll get there.
The third component, again, so 20,000 for Cook County-wide office, 12,500 for mayor of Chicago. But if you're running for statewide office, for U.S. Senate or governor or comptroller in the state of Illinois, it only takes 5,000 signatures to run. Does that make sense to anyone here? Doesn't make sense to me either. So another thing we're pushing for among our voting rights agenda at Change Illinois. And I will stop speaking and let Jim have a
Well,
shot.
let me just ask a
Sure.
couple follow-up questions. So when you talk about what Change Illinois is doing, your proposal for getting rid of redistricting as we know it, how does it work now?
How it works now is that the party in power tends to, well, I mean, you know, the last several cycles, it's literally come down to a name being drawn from a hat or a bull, and that determines which party has the power to draw the maps. We have experienced most recently several cycles of Democrats having the control and the power to draw the maps in Illinois. But I've been around long enough and paying attention to this and covered it as political writer and editor at the Daily Herald in 1990 when the Republicans had control of the map and drew the map and were able, at least for a couple of years, to win the majority in the Illinois House as a result.
And then what's so unusual about the way our maps look is that they aren't, you know, boxes here and county-wide. They're all over the place. You've all seen them, right? They're crazy looking.
This
Like a
district we're sitting
3-year-old
in,
did some scribbling.
Senator Morrison's district, somebody commented to me, looks like a cardinal sitting on a tree branch.
And so the reason for that is that the powers that be try to get as many votes for their candidate inside those crazy lines.
Exactly. They're drawing the districts so that they can best determine who's going to win. And, you know, people who look at these maps and determine whether or not they're going to put themselves out there and run recognize this. And so as a result, we have far less competition in our districts as we could and we should. In 2018, fully 49% of the Illinois House and Illinois Senate districts had only one candidate running. In 2016, it was even worse. It was 58% of the districts had only one candidate running. We've got to rise up and demand an end to that.
So I'm just going to say one little personal thing. So when I ran in 1998, it was a Republican-drawn district, and it was 70% Republican, 30% Democrat, approximately. No chance did I have. But there was never a Democrat that ran. Who would? I mean, when you think of it, and now, because of redistricting, I think it's close to 60% Democrat, but it's still, it's closer than 70-30. But these are the kinds of things that preclude others from wanting to put their name in the hat and say, I want to run for office, because it's already, the deck is stacked against them. These are just loopholes. Anyway, Jim, your turn.
Good afternoon, everyone. First off, I'd like to thank Nikki and Susan for inviting us to be here today with you, and also Nancy for that gracious introduction. I'm here to speak as the spokesman for the Chicago Election Board, primarily about voting access and systems that we've improved and systems that we think we can improve even more. However, I can't help but have some thoughts about some of these other topics as well, and I'll try to get myself in trouble this afternoon by being very frank about some of these topics. First off, on campaign finance, I'm curious here how many people I'm about to offend. So how many of you are fans of a baseball organization called the Chicago Cubs? If I can see a show of hands. Okay. Coming from Mundelein, I thought it'd be more. And it's good to come home. My mother was a League of Women Voters press person, if you will, for Libertyville, Mundelein, and Vernon Hills back in the day. And oddly enough, she took great pride in securing Stanley Cusper to come up to the Republican stronghold to speak. And here, I'm coming here as an election official from Chicago. So my besainted mother loved that. But on campaign finance, we've grown accustomed to using terms like blowing the caps and dark money. And I'm just afraid that we're slipping into allowing ourselves to use euphemisms for what I think is the most corrosive decision to emerge from our Supreme Court, and that's Citizens United. There's a reason that no joke ever begins with the words, two corporations walked into a bar. Corporations are faceless, nameless. They're legal constructs. They're legal constructs to shield entities, shareholders, and those shareholders' positions can change over time. I realize that there is branding that can go along with corporations so that you have certain wonderful thoughts about how McDonald's makes you loving it or whatever, but nonetheless, these are legal constructs that are not beholden to anybody and are not accountable. And yet we saw in this most recent city election in February 26th, and I'm sure the Ricketts will see this eventually, but we saw the Chicago Cubs, and I should preface this, has anybody here been near Clark and Addison in the last 10 months? Okay, you have seen that it has morphed into a baseball version of Streeterville. There have been a variety of developments that have happened there. And it just struck me as odd that all of this dark money, millions of dollars, could be targeted after one alderman, if not millions, hundreds of thousands of dollars, as well as an organization that doesn't reveal who its donors are. Because an owner of a baseball franchise or an ownership of a baseball franchise is disenchanted with the fact that they only got about 95% of what they wanted. So the 1% is upset that it didn't get 5%. So it's going to try to go after the aldermen. But for the fact that we had some, during this campaign, and I can talk about this when there's no runoff there, barring some miracle with vote by mail ballots that come in Monday or Tuesday, that Alderman Toney prevailed, and the voters had their say. And perhaps it was because of some untimely revelations of remarks by Grandpa Joe regarding religious beliefs, and maybe it was because of the Sinclair media deal that turned off some people. But whatever the reason, the voters had their say and overcame that, because the Cubs have made it clear that they want more, that it's not enough.
So Jim,
So-
so somebody ran against the sitting alderman,
Mhm.
Alderman Tunney, and that alderman, that candidate was supported by the Ricketts.
Well, it was more simple than that. It was just there was if you talk with the voters up there, their mailboxes and their when they were viewing news clips, even if you didn't live in that ward, I came across it as well. There was just a barrage of anti-Tunney pieces, and it's all related to this mind-bending ruling called Citizens United. And I'm glad that I'm before an audience, and hopefully another one that sees this video, that can exercise wisdom and logical skills and analytical powers that I believe the good people in this room possess, to know that there's something fundamentally wrong about unlimited amount of money being able to be thrown at something. And in this case, for whatever reason, the voters had their say. You know, there's still a way to overcome money with something as simple as knocking on doors. I've seen it over and over and over again. Entrenched political powers have been defeated by upstarts who simply canvass the ward or canvass the state representative district. They introduce themselves to voters. They can even have funny sounding names, and they can overcome the odds and get elected in districts that don't necessarily match their politics. As far as redistricting goes, I agree with many of the things that my former boss at the Daily Eastern News, by the way, Madeline Dubeck, she was the editor when I was the city hall guy in Charleston, Illinois. She points out there need to be modifications and simplifications of districts. Right now, as an election administrator, I can tell you that it's a crazy quilt of districts at the county level, at the state rep, state senate, judicial subcircuit, to the point that we have precincts that are fairly compact, that may have as many as 5 different ballot styles based on the address, the unique combination of puzzle pieces that apply to that address. And that causes people to get the wrong ballot styles. It causes complaints on election day. It's just, it's an unfortunate set, and it really undercuts people's desire to participate, because some of the motivating forces for voters are, oddly enough, anger, but also just competition, sensing that there's a competition, knowing we had one of the best turnouts ever, speaking of Stevenson, in 1982 at a midterm election, when nobody knew, and it came down to just very slight margin, who was going to win between Governor Thompson and Adlai Stevenson. Similarly, we had a huge turnout, 75%, when Harold Washington ran. And it was Mayor Jane Byrne, an incumbent, and Richard Daley, who was then the state's attorney, running. That's a presidential level of turnout. So I have a hard time when people say, oh, 35% this past week wasn't too bad. And I say, well, against 75% it is. And 35% is okay, it's good. It's way better than LA or Chicago, or New York or Houston or Miami, where they have elections even on warmer days. But still, 65% didn't. And
But Jim, what about other cities like Denver and their turnout, and different states? Their turnout's much, much higher. Is there a reason for that, maybe?
Denver hasn't been at the municipal level, but it probably will be this year, and that is because Denver undertook a series of reforms where they automatically mail out their ballots before Election Day. So this will be the first municipal election where they see the fruits of that effort. So as far as how Chicago does relative to other large cities or other Midwestern cities, our turnouts, even in February, are very solid. We're surpassed slightly by Minneapolis and a little bit more by Milwaukee, which is kind of the outlier because they have their municipal election, their most recent one, the same day that they were voting on the presidential primary. That's a little unfair. That's tilting the table. You know? We could do 53% if that were the case. But redistricting, I don't know that you're going to get nirvana in downstate areas that are fully red now. So I don't think you're going to be able to find competition in all the districts downstate. Similarly in Chicago, I don't think when you form compact districts, you're going to be able to find 50-50 Democratic-Republican mixes unless you take it and stretch it out from Ogle County to Lakeshore Drive. I don't think that's going to work. But there are better ways to form districts, and right now it disenfranchises voters. It does not give them enthusiasm to participate if they think that the table's tilted, the game is rigged, and there's no purpose in going out and participating in a competitive contest. Lastly, as far as modifications that we can make, going back to your question about Denver, we need to move incrementally toward automatic vote by mail, where it just happens. You just get the ballot. Right now you have to apply each and every election. We've made it more user-friendly, where we send out an email saying we've received your application, whether you apply online or by mail. We're sending you your ballot, and then lastly, we've got your ballot and it's being counted. So there's much more of a transactional value that you actually have in the polling place, where you see that ballot go into the scanner. You have a virtual transactional experience where you get confirmation. You're not operating on blind faith. I drop it in the mailbox and I hope it gets there. Now you're getting some kind of feedback. And Denver moved to this system after they had some rocky elections. No pun intended. Oh, man. It's some bad elections. So Denver moved to this model slowly, and that's what we would recommend for Illinois. In that first they developed what's called a permanent roster. And a permanent roster means once you've signed up for a vote-by-mail ballot, you're going to get one every election after that. And then it reached a tipping point where roughly 60% of the voters in any jurisdiction were getting their ballots automatically, and the 40% started calling in saying, my wife got hers, my neighbors got theirs, where's mine? Well, you got to sign up, and that became the tipping point, and then they went to full-blown vote-by-mail. And they also added a feature I would love to see in Illinois, and that is secure drop boxes, where you can go 24/7. You can provide those at schools, police stations, firehouses, what have you. Secure drop boxes that literally scan the outside of the envelope and send you a text saying, yep, it's there. It's in the secure drop box. And then when they transport those ballot envelopes to their headquarters, you get another message saying, yes, your ballot has been approved and it's being counted. So it's a very transparent process, and it actually allows low-funded campaigns to be competitive. If you think about it, if you want to monitor the polling places in Chicago, you need 2,000 volunteers. We have more precincts in the state of Iowa. So that is an advantage to a well-funded campaign. If you have an all vote-by-mail system where everything is being processed at one central location, that allows you to have 12 poll watchers. And you have just as much ability to oversee and check the transparency of the election process as a super wealthy candidate. So that's one of the reforms we'd like to see. We've made it easier for people to register to vote. You can register all the way up to and including Election Day, and you can use online systems with a driver's license or a state ID, even an outdated one from Illinois. We have early voting. We have no excuse vote by mail. If we can move it another step further, but before we do that, there's one last thing we would also need, and that is some real teeth to the prosecutorial powers, so that if someone abuses the vote by mail system and goes into a nursing home or uses their household coercive powers, whether it's over a spouse or a child or a parent, to try to manipulate that, there needs to be strong, heavy penalties like they have in one of our western states, Oregon, $1,000 per offense. So if you round up 85 ballots and they find out about it, there's no get out of jail free. There's possible jail time, hopefully real jail time, but also $1,000 per offense. So there was an organization that meant well, probably didn't cheat, but they were busted taking in 95 ballots, and they paid an $85,000 fine. That's the kind of enforcement we need if we're going to entrust that in Illinois. We know what our history is. I mean, my mom was a Republican, and we went to the parades and we watched State Senator Adeline J. Geocaris at every parade. And my parents were, Nixon Republicans, but they also voted for Grace Mary Stern for county clerk because they didn't trust the Republicans to control the ballot box in Lake County. True story. So they had that same apprehension about too much control in one hand, and I have the same feeling. So
Let me ask you a couple follow-up questions. I know the Chicago Board of Elections as being very progressive and identifying people who might want or need a mail-in ballot. Can you talk a little bit about what you do that at your level that differentiates you from other municipalities or even counties?
Well, I mentioned that we send out emails to alert people where the status is on their ballot and to try to work with them if there's a question that comes back, because what we have, and Madeline alluded to this, is a problem with outdated signatures. When you signed, when you moved in and you bought that house when you were 28, 35 years old, your signature has changed over the years. Sometimes signatures don't match. Other times we have minor problems. Be careful what you wish for with vote by mail. We had 100,000 when it was our modern record this past midterm election. And the problem that we ran into is that, let's say Stephanie and Joe are married. They both get vote by mail ballots and return envelopes. Stephanie signs the back of Joe's envelope and Joe signs the back of Stephanie's. The signatures don't match. They both get alerted that your ballot's not going to count. And the clerk who's processing that doesn't know why, why is that signed Stephanie? That doesn't match. They're operating in a vacuum, so we're trying to figure out little items like use a color sticker to make sure that they see that that's Stephanie's, and that only Stephanie returns her ballot in that one, and only Joe returns it in Joe's ballot or envelope. So there are all kinds of funny little things that happen on the way to reform.
And then one last question. I know that everybody's concerned about the security of voting. Can outsiders come in and hack? And we heard that the State Board of Elections did, in fact, say that we had been hacked. When I was with ICPR, we did a study with all the county clerks and found out that their biggest concern was the outdated voting machines. Mm-hmm. And if they had to get money for anything, it would be to update or purchase new voting machines. Tell me.
Absolutely, I echo that sentiment. We're looking forward to having a new generation of voting equipment, one that offers more auditability and verification. so that you not only have a paper trail, and you can still have a touch screen, but it produces a paper ballot that the person can verify. And if they're blind, they can feed it through a reader that can tell them through headphones, yes, your selections are on this ballot before they feed it into a scanner. So we could have a paper ballot for every single. We have a paper trail for every ballot, but it's in the touch screen. It stays with the touch screen. You verify it, and then the next voter pulls up and it's blank while they're voting. So we have a voter verifiable paper audit trail for every single ballot cast. We don't have machines that, like they've had in Florida and some other states, where there was no paper trail and then something went wrong and they couldn't recover from it. But the new technology has a scanned image of every single ballot. It captures a scanned image of when the voter. So even if you had some badly behaving poll workers or somebody else in the chain of custody were to overvote the ballots that were for their opponent, we would have the original scanned image of when the voter was feeding it in. You could hypothetically put out all million ballot images so that the public could audit that entirely. If they wanted to focus on one precinct or one ward or one state rep district, whatever, they could look at all of the ballots and see what logic was used in determining what the voter's choice was. So absolutely, we'd love to have new voting equipment. We look forward to it. It's important to note when you mention the hacking, what was hacked and what wasn't. The state election board's voter registration database was hacked. No vote records were changed. Each of the election jurisdictions, from Galena to Chicago and everywhere between, have their own databases that feed into the state. So it's not like the state's system was hacked and it affected anybody's voter registration at all. Also, none of the voting systems themselves were hacked. It would be very difficult to do that. It's a very decentralized system. You would have to go precinct by precinct and hack each machine. None of them are connected to the internet. I realize that's not a cure-all, but it's important to note that you would have to have a man or woman in the middle somehow messing with the programs. And lastly, we do have this paper audit trail now. So, and it's not hanging, pregnant, swinging, all the things our mothers worried about with CHADS. And so there are systems out there that we've already made good progress in knowing what the voter's intent was on every single ballot, but there's more that we can do in terms of security.
Well, your discussion has prompted a few questions from the audience. So why don't we start with you, and then we'll move down to David. How do you get someone off the permanent mail ballot roll, but how do you get somebody off the list when they pass away? Is this an issue?
It shouldn't be.
How many years does it take before?
No, that should be immediate. When we get a death certificate and we see that a voter has, we actually, the death certificates from the state Department of Public Health are intertwined with the State Board of Election Systems to flag death records almost immediately so that we can delete those records. The problem that we run into is that somebody registers as Davy and their death certificate has the formal David. So I ran into that recently with somebody at a 50,000 watt blowtorch, WGN radio. She says, my dad's still on the rolls and he died 8 years ago. I'm like, really? You had to do that on the air? Thanks,
That's
Patty.
prompted the question today, too.
And it found out, so I researched it afterward. I was like, get me his name, get me his information. And sure enough, it was one of those situations where he had registered under a nickname, but his death certificate had his formal, birth certificate-like name. So it's a lot better than it used to be. We would like to see it expand, and we're going to be approaching. We didn't get any good response from the Rauner administration. We're hoping to do better with the Pritzker administration. We would like to see the Illinois Department of Public Health tied into NAFSIS, which is the National Association of Public Health Statistics and Information Systems, so that if someone from Chicago dies in Arizona or Florida or West Virginia or a nursing home in Elk Grove, we find out about it. So we'd like to see that go interstate, so that if we have a matching date of birth, a full matching name, especially if it's a unique name, we can update that and we can capture that.
Don't you use a social security number?
Social Security number leads to, Social Security Administration can tell you that Social Security Administration kills people who aren't yet dead. So you can use it, but use it at your peril, especially with common names like Joseph Smith. It's very likely that there is going to be more than one Joseph Smith whose last 4 digits of their Social Security number ends in 3289 or whatever. So, they have a history of making really bad mistakes that people have to fight in court to get access to their bank accounts too, because they're not dead. So it's a great idea. We'd love to use it, but we'd love to dovetail it with those actual death certificates.
And the reason I ask that is I've heard that the biggest verifiable vote fraud we have is widows sending in mail ballots for dead spouses.
Show me a case.
I can't, I just.
Of course not.
I'm just telling you I've heard that.
The biggest vote fraud cases that we have right now happened most recently in North Carolina, and where you had a clear anomaly, and you have some loose rules where people can scoop up ballots on behalf of voters, and the number was so grotesque in this one county, and it was such a statistical anomaly that it gave everyone pause in a very close election. We're not immune from that in Chicago, believe it or not. We have a case under investigation right now where it probably won't have an impact on the contest itself, but we want to drill down deeper with the Attorney General's office, with the FBI and the U.S. Justice Department and the state's attorney's office to find out exactly what happened, because right now certain things don't add up in one precinct, and they don't add up nicely. So that's why I mentioned in my remarks that we need more teeth in our laws so that prosecutors can lower the boom on anybody who's tempted to do what you're talking about.
Thank you.
And what he was talking about was that, because it won't get picked up because you don't have a microphone, is that sometimes the widow signs the ballot for her husband who's deceased, or vice versa.
And I want to address one. There was one report that happened a few years ago. It was in 2016. It was like this. They started in L.A. and then they did it in Denver. So we saw it coming. And we knew they were going to hit us based on our proud reputation in Chicago. They said, oh, we got records of dead people voting. Well, in reality, by the time they got to us, we had the foresight to go through the records and find out what exactly they were going to look at. And in 99.9% of the occasions, it was a daughter. So the mother passed away, and both Stephanie the mom and Stephanie the daughter are both on the voter rolls. And Stephanie the daughter, you could make it out from the handwriting, it was clearly the daughter or the son. Or in some occasions where they had a very common name and they lived in a high-rise, like Joe Smith. The wrong Joe Smith signed the outdated one. And in one occasion, there was a very similar name where the judge of election clearly flipped open the wrong page, and so none of these voters voted twice. It's not like they voted on their own record and on Dad's record. They only voted once, and they were just mistakenly logged. It was a clerical error. So, this is not your grandfather's Chicago election board. We have a hard enough time getting people to vote once.
And you're doing a good job of
35%,
that, by the
thank
way. I'm going to move along to campaign finance. This is for David. Are there penalties for persons who who make lucrative contributions to campaigns? That person wins the campaign, and then the person making the contribution is appointed to a lucrative type position. Or does that happen at all?
That has been known to happen. There are many recent stories of that happening in Washington, D.C. in recent years. Yes, that has been known to happen, and there's no prohibition on it, although if it is done explicitly, as I will give you this money if you agree to appoint me to this position. That arguably would be a violation of federal law, quid pro quo, and would be prosecutable as a crime. But generally, the answer is no. People can get away with that kind of behavior and do regularly at both the state, and local, and federal levels.
Yeah, it might be a motivating factor to contribute.
Absolutely.
And along those lines, what will be the impact of Pritzker paying staff out of his own private funds? And his staff is the, 10, 15
Right.
deputy governor type people.
Right, so this was where he has said that in order to get adequately qualified people, get the best people in there, he's going to, out of his personal pocket, supplement their salaries with additional payments that are substantial. I am personally, and I think Reform for Illinois, a number of other organizations are troubled by that as a precedent, because it creates a problem. The problem that it creates is essentially that public official's duty is supposed to be to the public when they're hired and they're working for a public salary. And if they're being paid by a private individual, now they've got a divided loyalty. So that if that person who's paying part of their salary comes to them and tells them they want to do something that they shouldn't do as a public official, they're going to have a problem. So we think it is a bad idea. We understand the stated motivation, and I'm not necessarily questioning the good faith of that motivation, but I think it's a bad precedent and it's a bad thing to do. If he thinks he needs more money to get qualified people, he should make that case to the legislature and get the legislature to authorize higher salaries for those positions.
Yeah, and I think it's unprecedented. New York under Bloomberg, I think, did something similar,
Yes.
but other than that, it's really unprecedented. It's a different model. Okay, moving to Madeline. Is it possible for a minority victory in a newly redistricted area? I'm not sure
I'm not sure I understand
who
the
did
question.
this question? Minority victory.
I mean, I certainly think that we have seen in this last election, lots of new, we have more
Minority
than,
party. So if it's
more than
like what happened to
50.
me, being in a Republican district but winning as a Democrat.
so you're an example of the
I'm an
answer
example.
to that question.
It can happen, but it requires a lot of work. But it's unusual, isn't it?
It is very unusual. Yes, definitely. And, the people who are drawing the maps draw them in order to know that the outcome is going to be that their favored candidate from their political party wins. And that happens more often than not, and that is why the party drawing the map typically has the majority in the Illinois House or the Illinois Senate.
Can I just
Yeah,
add something to
go
that?
ahead.
Please.
The problem has gotten much worse with the advent of much more sophisticated databases and computers that allow the people who draw the maps to do much more specific and detailed analyses and draw the maps in a much more calculated way. In fact, the Wisconsin case that went up to the Supreme Court and then was not decided, the Whitmore case, involved a situation where basically 48% of the state's voters elected a supermajority of that minority party's representatives in their state legislature because of the gerrymandering. And that was the result of many. They ran through hundreds of models of different possible gerrymanders to pick the one that basically best suited their party.
I would point out, though, that it doesn't always work. That's the wonderful saving grace of the voters participating and having the final say. I remember a situation where a young candidate who was largely unknown worked not too far from here in the Lincolnshire area. I think his name was Charlie Cardella. Ran against two more moderate Republicans for state representative. Didn't really reveal a lot about himself until he won the primary against the two female competitors. And the Democrats pounced on it because they realized his philosophies were no match for the voters in that district, which extended from, back then, I want to say Deerfield, Highland Park, out to Buffalo Grove. And then the Democratic Party came together and they nominated Lauren Beth Gash, and she won in that Republican district. So, there are occasions where the voters answer the bell. So it's not.
There are, but
There-
those are the
but I realize,
exceptions, not the rules.
unfortunately, they are the exceptions. You're right.
Can I just throw something out? You know,
Yeah,
there is a operation, database collection called Tiger Files. And with Tiger Files, you can actually do a better job of putting together the districts, because you could actually, with that, to make it a competitive district, you could intentionally make them competitive by just making the equal number of Republicans and Democrats in the primary election.
Well,
And
you
I
can
don't
certainly
know
set up
that
rules where
let
you
the
have to get
politics
close, you know, within a certain number of percentage points. You could
Yeah.
certainly set up a system like that.
Yeah, if a system could be to encourage
The-
competition.
It does, but there are limits on that, because then you'd have to get, as Madeline pointed out, it wouldn't be a geographically compact district in some areas of the state.
so,
So-
yeah, the question was, there's something called the Tiger File, which allows for a more balanced Republican-Democrat redistricting process. And why don't we use that? I think it's really what you're saying.
And presumably, if there were an independent redistricting commission where one party wasn't in control over the other, you would get a result that was a lot closer to that.
And before I forget, one of the better
lost
Supreme
control.
Court one of the better Supreme Court decisions recently was when they backed the Arizona voters who had put in a redistricting commission, and the forces that were in power in Arizona tried to undo the voters' will, and it reached the Supreme Court, and they said, no, the voters had their say, get out of the way.
So how many states have redistricting commissions or panels? Or are most states like Illinois where it's the party in power gets to do the doodling?
I don't know the answer
Yeah.
to that question. I know Arizona has a commission, California has a commission, Iowa. I know that there's growing momentum in this past year. 5 more states instituted through their voters some form of independent redistricting commission work. Several of them are our neighbors, Michigan being one. And that's an amazing story there. It was literally started by a Facebook post, and all kinds of citizens jumped on and got involved in that. Ohio approved a different approach in May of last year. Missouri voters approved something in November. Same thing in Colorado and Utah. So there's growing momentum. There's also a couple of Supreme Court cases that will be heard in a couple of weeks on March 26th by the U.S. Supreme Court, a Maryland Democratic gerrymander and a North Carolina Republican gerrymander. So fingers crossed that the Supreme Court this time gives us an outcome we can all benefit from. But I'm not holding my breath.
I wouldn't hold my breath.
Neither would I. I wouldn't hold my breath on that case, but the momentum that Madeline just referenced, there's a pattern in the United States where states adopt populist actions like this, and it reaches a tipping point where it just spreads like wildfire. So these are very, very positive things that are happening, because even if it's only 12 or 15 or 20 right now, it will reach a tipping point where it becomes imperative on other states.
The other thing I should mention is that Governor Pritzker is a repeated vocal proponent of redistricting reform. He participated in a survey Change Illinois did with all the candidates for governor in 2018 and said that he would veto a gerrymandered map. Now, the reality of politics today is that there are so many Democrats in the Illinois General Assembly that they could override him should they choose to do so. But it is our hope that this momentum and that particular person in the governor's office will use his influence at some point before 2020 to push this forward and get Speaker Madigan and President Cullerton to call these amendments for a vote.
So along
But
those,
we need all of you to put pressure on your lawmakers, to put pressure on their leaders to do that.
and you want them to sign a witness slip in support of.
Please, yes.
How do they do that?
Go to the easiest way for me to give you a
Everybody write
quick
this down.
start is to go to the ilga.gov. You'll see a column on the left-hand side where you can type in the bill number, which in this case, again, is HJRCA 15 or SJRCA 4. That will click a button that will call up the bill for you. At the top of the page, you'll see something that says witness slips. That will take you to a page that will walk you through the process of filling those out.
But the trick is to know when to do that. You just don't do that anytime, do you?
That is true. It has to be to the point where it's called for a hearing, and that hasn't happened yet in this process. Thank you for pointing that out. So the most important thing you can do right now is to get in touch with your state representatives and state senators and ask them to sign on as sponsors.
Well, those
At
of us
the-
that are activists sign up to a notification service, so we're told when to file witness slips. Do we have one?
Excellent, thank you.
Do we have one such as that for your?
Not that I'm
They
aware
have to
of.
Excuse me, this is something that we'd like to talk about at the very end of this session. I'm going to give you some ways to be informed. I also, I'm a little embarrassed to confess this, but I signed my very first witness slip myself a couple weeks ago and was surprised at how easy it is. So if you'll hold those questions till the very end, we'll talk about it. Thank you.
So along those lines, we're saying that the Supreme Court ultimately makes the decision whether or not the case is valid on the redistricting. So was it Judge Mikva who ruled on the last case? And she kind of teased us and said, here's something that you might want to consider. She didn't quite say it like that. And I don't know, David or Madeline or Jim, if you kind of could read between the lines and grasp the message she was trying to say to organizations like Change that are crusading for a redistricting commission.
Yeah, Judge Mary Mikva ruled on the petition that was signed by, I think, 600,000 Illinois residents saying we want this to be on the ballot about setting up an independent redistricting commission, and she held that that was permissible under the Illinois Constitution. That decision was then appealed, and on appeal, the Illinois Supreme Court, on a purely partisan division, said no, the Illinois Constitution does not allow this because we interpret this constitutional provision about what's allowed by way of ballot initiatives in Illinois extremely narrowly, even though Judge Mikva had sort of taken the pains to lay out in her view a roadmap about why this should be allowable and how it even could be improved in the future. But the problem we have is that in Illinois we have this constitutional provision that does limit ballot initiatives, and most of the other states that have adopted this reform have done so not through the legislature but through citizen-led ballot initiatives, and those decisions by our Illinois Supreme Court make that a very, very difficult, if not impossible, route for this issue to take in Illinois.
Back to Jim. Voting by mail seems to have the potential to make voting easy and convenient for all qualified voters. Yet in Lake County, there are still significant obstacles such as multiple steps and complicated deadlines. Please discuss ways to streamline the process, keeping in mind the possible cost.
Well, online applications work because ultimately you're verifying the signature when the ballot comes in the envelope. We're already seeing, just in this past week, we flipped the switch on the online system on Tuesday the 5th, and I think by today we already had 15,000 people apply online for this upcoming April 2nd election, and so that bodes well for turnout.
But don't you do a lot of promoting and?
We do send out emails to every voter whose email address we have, basically inviting them to apply to vote by mail.
And so does that happen in Lake County? I've never gotten an
I don't
email.
know. I don't
Has
know.
anybody received it?
I did hear something before the meeting began today that someone was concerned that giving their email address to the local election authority could result in it being appended to their voter registration record and then abused by campaigns. We take a very dim view of sharing voter phone numbers and email addresses from the Chicago Election Board, because we're the ones who actually deal with voters, and we are the ones who deal with complaints about robocalls and spam texts and all kinds of other inconveniences. So I wish state law would change so that the state board would not give out that information to campaigns. We're mulling whether or not we have to feed that to the State Board of Elections to avoid that very
I don't think
problem.
they give out email addresses.
You don't, huh? Okay.
On the county clerk's website, it says that if you request an absentee or a vote by mail ballot online, you must provide your email address, and by state law, the county must make that email address available to campaigns.
So,
There's
but there again, I mean,
legislators, wherever you are listening.
I mean, one of the things that we have to recognize is that people can come to your door. They don't often anymore, but they can come to your door. It's political speech is protected by the First Amendment. They can also hit your mailbox, your snail mailbox, and they can also hit your email box. What we tell people when they get their phone calls used to be a bigger phenomenon when there were landlines, which are going away, is if you don't like the call, hang up. If you don't like the junk mail, throw it out. If you don't like the email spam, delete it. I mean, this is one of the minor inconveniences to, people are reaching out to you trying to get you to vote, to participate. That's not a big, nasty thing.
If I could just add to that, Jim, in my work with the Civil Liberties Committee, I find that campaigns can easily get people's phone numbers and email addresses through other databases that are available commercially these
true.
days, and that are much more comprehensive than the state.
That's true.
state's database.
That's an excellent point, because every time you order a pizza delivered to your house and you order that with a credit card, you have just associated your phone number with your credit card and your name and your address, and now they've got the rest of the pieces of the puzzle for what they just had a name and an address for. So whether you're ordering online, whether you're doing something with some kind of online transaction, when you share that email address so that you can get an alert that your new fishing lures are coming, that can and will be sold by marketing firms.
One last question, and then Nikki, you want to come up and do, but let me do this one. How is the Board of Elections handling automatic voter registration in general, but this says with high school students? Are there any issues with automatic voter registration that we need to hear about today?
Yes,
Yeah, it's not being done.
it's not automatic yet, even though it's state
Even
law
though
that we
everybody
all
says it
fought
is. Don't tell
to
Jesse
get
White.
approved. The Secretary of State's office is not really making it automatic, requiring people to sign 2 or 3 times when they go in to renew their driver's license. And there are a group of us who are pushing for this to be done properly and then to be expanded to other state agencies that we all interact with on a regular basis.
So
Yeah,
there-
everybody thinks it's in place, but it's really not.
It's not. So what happens is if you're already registered and you go in to update your driver's license, then it kind of automatically updates your registration. What's not happening, though, is someone who's not registered is not always, their record doesn't automatically go forward. And the reason is that the Secretary of State's office is behind schedule, in spite of what they say publicly, on adopting what's called Real ID. And Real ID helps associate every driver's license and state ID with a birth certificate or a naturalization paper, and that way we avoid the entrapment scenario where a non-citizen comes in, gets a driver's license or a state ID. If you automatically register that person, then the election board is going to send them out, or the county clerk is going to send them out, here's your voter card, and then at election time say, here's where you go vote.
they do it.
So it's basically like, you know, inviting someone to get deported. So until they get the real ID element in there, unfortunately, they're behind doing that. Most other states have had real ID in place for a long time. That's why when you go to the airport, you're often told the Illinois driver's license or state ID is not going to hold up necessarily.
So before Nikki comes, I just want to thank the panelists. Very provocative. Lots of questions came out of this discussion. But each of them are experts in their own field, and they're all working extremely hard to make it right. And there aren't, I mean, legislators do the same thing, but these are the groups behind making sure that we have total access to voting, that there's a redistricting voice in Springfield, and that campaign finance reform is not going to go away. That discussion is stronger now than ever before. So thank you very much for your comments. It was a delight to hear, and I'm sure all of you really enjoyed listening to what they had to say. I know Nikki wants to talk a little bit.
Okay, thank you so much, and thank everyone for the great questions that came up. A few things I wanted to mention. So we have some really terrific organizations represented here that can help us stay informed on these issues, and for those who are asking about what they could do, I think the best thing that we can encourage you to do is to stay in touch with these organizations. We have Reform for Illinois, we have the Center for Illinois Politics, we have Change Illinois. All of them have great websites. They all have a social media presence. If you're on Facebook, follow their page. Go to their websites and sign up to receive emails, because that's a very good way to find out when it is the appropriate time to submit witness slips or contact your legislators. Another excellent resource I would suggest is the League of Women Voters. League of Women Voters members, if you join our local league like Forest Lake Bluff, you're automatically also a member at the county, state, and national level. The state and national Leagues of Women Voters put out emails, action alerts to all of their members when it's time to take action on something. That could be witness slips, that could be contacting your legislators. They generally make it very easy to do. Sometimes you just click a button and you're connected. With the witness slips, they've sent us very detailed instructions. Excuse me. So if you are not yet a member of the League of Women Voters, we do encourage you to join us. We've got some forms out there. And as I said, stay in touch with all of these other organizations as well. We're going to put a page up on our website. It'll probably be up by tomorrow morning. And you'll find that at LWVLFLB, for League of Women Voters, Lake Forest Lake Bluff.org/democracy. And we will include links to all of these organizations and also instructions on how to file a witness slip when it's an appropriate time to. Once you've filed a witness slip, you can actually locate it on the Illinois General Assembly website, which is very cool. You can see how you responded and how your friends and neighbors responded, if they did. So we will make all of those resources available to you on our website, lwvlflb.org/democracy. I wonder if any of our panelists can give us any additional ideas real quickly right now as to ways that people can stay informed of how they can take action. We did hear that Fair Maps Amendment. Our state reps have not yet signed on to that, so that's something that we'll put information about on our website as well. And that is a bipartisan effort. It was introduced in the Senate by a Democrat and in the House by a Republican at the same time. You will see well-known Republican and Democratic legislators have signed on to it. There's no reason why anyone who's interested in good government should not support that. David, can you think of anything that people can actually do in regard to?
One thing I would suggest is there have been a new version of the an Illinois campaign finance reform law that's modeled on the one that was passed a couple years ago in the Senate, that have been reintroduced in the Illinois House and Senate. I don't have the bill numbers, but Kelly Cassidy is the sponsor in the House, and Heather Steins is the sponsor in the Senate. So I would encourage you to take a look at those. It is not clear to us whether it's likely to come up for a vote in either of those places this legislative year, but watch our site for alerts.
Yeah, if we can locate that, I'll add them to that page as well. And again, just have it on your radar. Just be aware that there may be things that we can do. Jim or Madeline, any other suggestions for ways that people can take action?
I just wanted to point out that I brought some fact sheets on the two pieces of legislation that I mentioned here today. Somebody asked a question at the end there about high schools. There is a law now that students who are going to be voting age can get registered to vote, 17-year-olds. There are organizations, including ours, that are looking at proposals to get 16-year-olds into that queue, ready to go for when they're 18 and can vote as well. I don't think we have a bill number on that yet, but that is something that we're working toward. So keep those things in mind, and really the best thing is, as you said, to sign up for emails on all of our websites to stay in touch, because we'll definitely let you know when it's time to file a witness slip.
And I think I'm safe in saying that these are not the organizations that are going to be selling your email addresses.
That's correct. At least in our case, that's
Okay.
correct.
Definitely not.
Just a couple of final things. As you leave later after having some refreshments, we do have a survey we'd like you to take a quick minute to complete. We'd like to have some way of kind of assessing what you think of our programs, how relevant they are to you, what you think about our panelists. And I have to say, I'm so thrilled with the panelists we've had today. They've been wonderful. So now please do come and have some refreshments, because we have enough to feed an army of at least 150, and there aren't that many of you. And if our panelists can stay around, please do, and then people are welcome to ask questions. Oh, and thank you so much to Susan Garrett. We really appreciate it.